All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, because I literally think we have the world on here. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Kevin Simpson from the Association of International Educators and Leaders of Color. We want to say thank you for joining us for today's talk that will be facilitated by Dr. Danau Tanu. And I know she said she doesn't want to be known by Dr. Tanu, so I'll call her Danau. We have also joining us Meadow Dibble, and I believe Brittany. I'm not sure if she's on or not. I know it's early on that side of the coast. So we'll introduce TIE Online opportunities to collaborate and do some writing with them. So we always like to get started with just a quick self-check, just to make sure, because again, you may have been at work all day. You might just be starting your day. It's early for some of us. It's getting into the early evening for some of us. So just taking a moment just to do that self-check-in. So if you want to turn off yours, especially if you've been on either Teams, Zoom, or Google Classroom all day, taking a moment just to pause, whether it's drop your shoulders, taking a breath in and out, might be standing up if you've been sitting for the day, or just rubbing your palms back and forth just to get in that mode where you're checking in with yourself. So we'll give you a couple of minutes just to do that before we get started. And again, this is just something we even recommend you do with your scholars, with your staffs. It's just taking that time to check in with ourselves. We know we've been living in interesting, different times, whether you have been inside sheltering in place. I know some people are still doing, or you're out and about, you've made it back to respective countries to start work, and things of that nature, or you might be in quarantine right now. We know everyone's in different places around the world. So, but that self-check is so crucial. I'm finding it where I'm being more intentional daily to get out of the chair, get out of the inside, just to take in just air and getting back into touch with nature. If you just join us, we are recording. We do ask that everyone just presses mute, and we'll get started in a few. Miss Blue's on here, so I'm gonna turn over to her in a bit after we have a message from Miss Dibble. Our flow for the day is simple. We'll introduce AIELOC and TIE Online, and then we turn it over to then we turn over to Dominique, who will introduce Dr. Tano, and then we'll have some time for breakouts and then do our closing, which is our commitment to action. So I'll turn it right on over to Meadow. You want to introduce TIE Online and opportunities that folks can have with you all.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Brittany is here on the call, so I don't know if Brittany, if you want to jump in, but I am really happy to be with you here today. Super thrilled about the collaboration between TIE and AIELOC. We are if you don't know, we've been around for 35 years as a newspaper, as a recruiting service, and we are just increasingly looking to serve as a platform to amplify your voices, your students' voices, and let me also mention alumni from your schools, and specifically the issue of anti-racism in the international school sector is an area of real specific concern to us and importance, that one that we want to push. So you may contact me at any moment through by going to our website or editor@tieonline.com. We take submissions on a rolling basis, so there really are no deadlines. If you have something that you want to share, just send it right along. Sometimes it takes me, you know, a bit to get back to you. Please, as Kevin says, give me a bit of grace. We have a very, you know, we've got a small staff, but we do absolutely want to hear from you, and put your views out there in the world. Thanks, Kevin.
So thanks, Meadow. And Brittany, you're on with us early. See if Brittany's there. Hey, Brittany, you're on there?
Well, I am here. I
Oh.
thank you so much, Meadow, for sharing those words from Ty. Kevin, thank you for reaching out to me as well. We're just very happy to have this collaboration with you and looking forward to this wonderful conversation. It's been an honor to be able to help co-facilitate these conversations and serve as a platform for everybody. So thanks so much.
Definitely. Thank you both, Brittany and Meadow. And just short on AIELOC, or Association of International Educators and Leaders of Color. It's currently a Facebook affinity group, which started in 2017, turned into an association with the focus of amplifying the work of international educators and leaders of color, primarily focused on advocacy, research, and learning. We're gonna keep it moving. I'm gonna turn it right on over to our AIELOC Advisory Council member, Dominique Blue, who's gonna introduce Dr. Tanu, and we're gonna get started. I'm gonna mute. All yours, Dominique.
Good day, everyone. Good day. So let me tell you a little bit of my story and my connection to Dr. Tanu. So during the 2017-2018 school year, I experienced structural racism at the international school I worked in. To make sense of what I experienced, I began to research racism in international schools. The research is very scant, but I came across the work of Dr. Danau. Specifically, her dissertation immediately grabbed my attention. She named the phenomenon that I was experiencing and had witnessed as well working in an international school. Her work was very insightful and reaffirming to what I had experienced. Dr. Danau is an anthropologist and honorary research fellow at the University of Western Australia and soon to be postdoctorate fellow at Waseda University on a Japan Foundation research fellowship. She has written the first and only book on structural racism in international schools, Growing Up in Transit, The Politics of Belonging at an International School. To collect her data, she went back to an international school to conduct interviews and participant observation by going to classes and hanging out with high school students for a full year while in her 30s. She is also the co-chair, the co-chair of the Families in Global Transition, FIGT Research Network, and a co-founder of TCKs of Asia, which does a fantastic job of supporting Asian TCKs and bringing awareness to their lived experience. It is an honor to have Dr. Tanu with us to discuss the nuances of systemic racism in international schools through the voice of students. If you have not been living under a rock, you know students have been passionately using their voices to amplify their experiences with racism in international schools around the world, right? So what we are about to experience is urgent, it is timely, and it is crucial to providing us with real background knowledge to serve our students and our school communities the best, right? So here is Dr. Danau. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm a bit embarrassed by the introduction. And so no more doctor from now. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here because, you know, I get to talk to teachers who are at the front lines of what's happening right now in the international school communities. But before I start, I wanted to do something that we do in Australia when we start an event, which as a new immigrant, so I'm in Perth right now in Australia. And as a new immigrant, I really appreciated doing this at the start of events because it kind of immediately gave me an understanding, you know, very tiny, but at least it was better than nothing, understanding of where, about Australia in terms of the land that we're standing on. And it's called an Australian custom called Acknowledgement of Country, which respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the land that I'm living on. And so I acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Nuer people, where I am in Western Australia. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of various lands on which all of you are on today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting, and any other First Nation peoples meeting with us around the world. And I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. So thanks a lot. So let's start. And today, so as you all know, as Dominique said, you know, if you're not living under a rock, then obviously you're aware of the discussions that's been happening. And I've been, you know, I've actually watched all the webinars that AIELOC has organized, and I'm thrilled that this is finally happening. But I find that a lot of the discussions at the moment, you know, there's a sense of, but how do we convince this parents? How do we convince the school administrators? And that, you know, sometimes the argument against doing anti-racist work is that, you know, the parents don't want it. They're the ones who pay the school fees, and they want white teachers, and so there's nothing we can do about it, kind of thing. And I find that that's a lame excuse, because if that's the way we did education, then we'd still be doing rote learning, corporal punishments, girls wouldn't be in schools, and so on. And after speaking to some teachers, I find that, you know, sometimes teachers are in a position where they're able to, they're on the front lines, but because they are dependent on the school for their employment, that they can't speak as vocally. And so I think in this sense, alumni, as they are doing right now, and researchers can, I guess in a way, speak up more, because we don't, you know, we're not afraid of losing our jobs. And so myself, I'm a researcher, as Dominique said, I'm an anthropologist, but I'm also a product of the international school system. I went to international schools from basically K to 12, except 1 year in a Japanese public school, and identify as a third culture kid. Now, but before I really get into the topic, I want to, because these kinds of discussions often gets a bit tense, uncomfortable, I wanted to use a tactic that we've been using in TCKs of Asia, which is to acknowledge our own privileges first. And I think that's sort of for me at least, it's an easier way to make the uncomfortable discussion a bit more comfortable, so to speak. And so my premise is that, you know, everyone's a little bit racist in a way, or we all have racial biases, and we all have privileges in one way or another that impact others. And we, you know, we might do things unintentionally that, you know, using our privilege and be blind to it. And I acknowledge that families, friends, even students have called me out for my prejudices sometimes. And so I'd just like to acknowledge the privilege that I have. First of all, I speak English as my first language with an accent that is considered the right accent, got a university degree. So you know, just that would make me in the top 1% socioeconomically in the world. Canadian passport, skin color-wise East Asian, you know, and that's a lot of privileges come with that. My mother is Japanese, so my father is Indonesian of Chinese background, mother is Japanese. And because Japan had colonized the region, you know, we are still benefiting from that imperial legacy today, and able-bodied, heterosexual, so on and so forth. Where I don't have privilege is as a woman, and not being white, and also coming from a family background that does not speak English at home. Which really mattered a lot as a kid when I was going to the international school, even though now it might not matter as much. So now I'd like to go to just turn my slides on and get into the topic. So what do students think? International schools in the eyes of third culture kids, that's sort of where my emphasis is, because there's so much newness in the international school system that's not, you know, that might be different in from other places. What will we cover? We'll look at the student's perspective first, the student's experience of the international school, and then look at how school administrators, teachers, and curriculum sustain structural racism in international schools, and then look at, you know, the nuances and things that are different from, say, in the US or Australia and so on. And I guess in the breakout session, perhaps we can go into more into strategies of what we can do. So, first of all, so that you can use this to advocate and, you know, to school administrators and so on, I'd like to start by talking about, so this is evidence-based research, this is anthropology, but there's, you know, often a bias towards qualitative research. But even though it's qualitative, it's not anecdotal. I spent 1 year at an international high school, doing participant observation, going to classes, hanging out with the kids at school, extracurricular activities, came on Saturdays and evenings for theater performances, etc. And I did this for a year and interviewed about 130 people, 1 to 2 hours each. And then what happens with qualitative research is that you wait until the data is saturated, where you interview new people, the details are different, but the themes are the same, and you kind of get bored, really, because, you know, you start to see patterns and they're all about the same. Then you say that the data has been saturated, and then you analyze the patterns and triangulate. So between, you know, the data that I get from the teachers and the students and the alumni and so on and so forth, as well as, you know, the interview data and the participant observation data, and also the research literature. Do they match up? Are they confirming each other? So that's sort of, and the strength of qualitative research is that we get to the nuances, right? I blended it a bit more than Adam Sandler because it was a high school. And I know there are different types of international schools, but this one was quite mixed, mostly Asian though, and the breakdown's right there. And the schools are sites of, what they say in social science is that it's a site of cultural reproduction. So schools is where you reproduce class structures. It's where you reproduce racist structures. It's kind of designed that way, really. And so we need to actively counter that in order to break down those class structures. Right. So I want to start with the main third culture kid literature by, you know, started by David Pollock and Ruth Van Raken. Actually, Ruth is here with us today, I've seen. When I first read that, I read the first edition, and the third edition is now a lot more diverse. So I would encourage you to read the third edition. But I felt like, and the discourse happening in the third culture kid community was that my experience as an Asian going to an international school just wasn't really there at the time. This was about 10 years ago. You know, and so the dominant narrative is that for third culture kids, international schools feel like home. This is where they feel most like they belong. But for me, coming from a background where I don't speak English at home, I'm not Western, my family background's not Westernized, I felt like an immigrant kid almost going to the school, because you spend 12 hours a day, or sorry, 8, you know, feel like I'm Western by day and Asian by night, completely different school and home culture. And what I learned in that sense is internalized racism. And this is what we'll hear a lot about this. And I also wanted to say that probably everything I say today, a lot of you are already aware of, but I guess I'm gonna put a bit more structure to what you already know, so you can advocate for the students. So internalized racism is where you have this sense of superiority towards others who don't have the privileges you have, and a sense of inferiority towards others who have more privileges than you have. And I'm gonna put voices of the students, LIANNE first, and alumni. She was about 30 maybe when I interviewed her. And she talks about when, as a kid, she really internalized the sense of superiority and sense of, you know, I'm better than others. And her father's Singaporean, but her mother's Indonesian. And she said that when I was younger, you know, if now I don't care, but before, oh my God, when I was a little kid, I would have been a snob about it, like about going to international school, about speaking English. Yeah, I would have been a complete snob about it because it means I'm more superior, much more superior. There are some things that's like passed on to you because of the international school. All of a sudden you're like on a pedestal. There was this feeling of superiority, definitely because of the affiliation with the school and because of the language, right? Command of the language, and by that she means English, because of the people you hang out with, because of the extracurricular activities. And so she's saying that, you know, compared to the Indonesians, her cousins and so on and so forth, she felt superior towards her friends and towards the locals. And she says, you know, if the person I was communicating with was not up to my standard in English, like, forget it, complete snob. And oops. And she says, I think because our teachers are mostly Americans, I think that a lot of our study material textbook was based out of the States. I mean, I learned what the penny was before I learned about the rupiah. Rupiah is the Indonesian currency. And social studies was always about American history before world history. And then I go to university, and she went to university in Melbourne. She says, it's like, oh, colonization. How come I didn't study that at school? Duh, we were being colonized at the school. And I honestly think that it was just the system, the operating system of the school, the workbook, the teachers, and the, you know, and back then it was mostly American kids in her school. And I forgot to mention that the school is in Indonesia. And MAURA, she talks about, so she's mixed race. I think mother is Filipino, father is white American. But she grew up mostly in Asia. And she says, oh, when I go back to the US, I hate being in the States. Whenever I go to the States, I walk into Chicago airport, I have like a cultural shock because everyone's white and it freaks me out. I've lived in Asia all my whole life. So then it's like, I'm used to seeing Asians everywhere and like walking into an airport, being the tallest person and so on and so forth. And I guess because I'm white, I feel like, oh, this sounds bad. And she kind of hesitates to share what she felt, but then I said, go on. And she said, because it's like, if you're white in Asia, you have this sense of power because you're white in Asia. Do you get what I mean? So yeah, then when I'm in the States, everyone else is white and I'm the same as them. And I feel like intimidated. They scare me. I kind of have an Asian mentality. And so, as you can see, she's internalized the structures, the racist structures. And this is quite a common narrative where a lot of mixed race kids, when they go back to the US, have a cultural shock where suddenly they're Asian. In Asia, they're white, and then they go back to the US and they're Asian, and they haven't learned how to deal with this. And Yumi, a Korean student, and she talks about, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she talks about how when she first came to the international school, you know, she was just completely intimidated that, you know, so many white kids in the school. And she says, but, you know, she wanted to be friends. She wanted to be international because that's what the school wants. That's what the parents want. That's what she wants. But when she tried to talk to the English speaking kids, the American kids, the Australian kids, whatnot, she says the conversation never got anywhere. It was always, you know, say hi. I mean, they say hi and say only service talk. Like, you know, just how's the weather, not like deep talk. So I couldn't join the group and my English wasn't that good. So then I just play with the Korean friends, I guess. And you know how this school really doesn't like Koreans? You know how the impression is Koreans are always studying because Koreans never go to parties, etc. And so the impression isn't that great. And you hear this a lot where the Korean students and, you know, Indonesian students, Japanese students, whatever, they can sense that the school doesn't like them. The school thinks they're a burden because they don't make the school look good because they're always hanging out or among themselves or speaking in their own language, even though the teachers don't say it directly to them. And why does this matter? Why, in particular, the thing I want parents to know is that it really affects them when they grow up. Sorry, lost, yeah. Because it affects, it creates a disconnection between the parent and this child. And this is something that parents aren't aware of when the child is young. But when they grow up, you know, lately I've been talking to a lot of Asian TCKs who can't speak their home language properly. And they say, you know, and my parents are frustrated that I can't speak it. I'm frustrated, but like, what am I supposed to do? This is what they wanted. They wanted me to learn English and I learned English and now I can't talk to them and I have to use a dictionary to write emails to them. And you can sense the pain when they're adults. You know, when they're kids, they're just trying to fit in. And so they shed their home language, but as adults, you can sense the pain there. LIANNE, going back to LIANNE, the Singapore Indonesian girl, she says, you know, when I was younger, I felt smart because I spoke English, and my mom would speak to me in Bahasa Indonesia, and she speaks great English, but you know, she's able to communicate, but she prefers to speak in her native tongue. And so later on, I find out when I'm 18 or whatever, she didn't want me to lose my native tongue. That's why she kept talking to me in Bahasa Indonesia. But as a kid, you know, the more I learned English, the more I was able to talk back to her in English, and it made me feel smart, you know. And so as a kid, she thought this was fun and games to kind of subvert the power relations with, as a child, towards her parents. But as an adult, then she could kind of appreciate the pain, the grief that the mother had gone through in terms of realizing that the child is culturally different, don't speak the language as well. And in the interviews, you can feel the pain there. And I've also spoken to parents who have talked about this grief, you know, the moment they realize that their kid isn't quite as Korean or quite as Indian or, you know, Indonesian, and the sense of separation from their child, cultural separation. So it's almost like they're linguistically and culturally displaced, even within the family, even though they're not moving anywhere. Just by going to the international school, they're culturally displaced inside the home. And the main thing is a lot of parents don't understand this until it's sort of too late to recover the language skills. A Korean boy was talking about how, you know, when I was younger in primary school, my mom's like, learn English, learn English, learn English. So I did. And then I got to middle school and mom's like, oh, no, he's turning too American. And then she'd buy all these Korean textbooks and it's like, learn Korean, learn Korean, learn Korean. And so I did that. And so this is something that the kids go through. And parents are very unaware of it. Now, as an adult, Haewon is an alumni and she's got children. And she talks about how her husband, who is, she calls him local Korean guy, that she married. So she identifies as a third culture kid, went through the international schools, but married a Korean who had never lived abroad as a child. And so the father, so the husband really wanted their children to go to international school. So what they did was he remained in Korea and worked in Korea while Haewon and her two children would go to Singapore and live in Singapore to send them to international school because it's cheaper to send them to international school in Singapore than in Korea. And so the father's shuttling back and forth. And this is quite common among Koreans and a lot of other Indonesians as well. And she says that, and she was really against this because she said, do you know what you're going to do? Because, you know, you're going to end up with kids like me, completely confused about our identity and so on and so forth. But the husband just could not understand it. And so he won that education battle. So they went to Singapore and now it's been about 3 years, I think. And she says now the kids have gotten used to speaking in English and culturally have become accustomed to that. And so when the husband comes to visit, she can tell that the husband feels a bit excluded, sort of like can't join in because he doesn't get the language skills aren't there. And also he doesn't get the cultural references and the feel isn't there. And so you can see this sort of separation within the family. And as a third culture kid, when she was choosing the international school, she wanted a school where it wasn't about assimilating, but it was like a two-way integration. So when she was taking tours for the international school, she chose this particular one, the Canadian school in Singapore, where she says, you know, on the tour, they took us to a Chinese classroom and then she saw a blonde, blue-eyed girl speaking in fluent Chinese. And she thought, that's the kind of international school I want to go to. I want my kids to go to, because having experienced the one-way assimilation type, she wanted something that was a bit more equal, that was not about assimilation. So the student's perspective, from the structural perspective, I spoke to quite a few teachers and I found that the white teachers who were married to Indonesians, locals, were the most critical about what was going on in the school. Possibly because they felt like it should be equal, but they themselves were not treated equally because they were local hires, and because when they would take their Indonesian wife to social gatherings, it just didn't feel comfortable. And also their children are going to the international school, and they say, you know, there's a sense that the kids, because they're growing up in this, are starting to look down on their mother. And I don't want them to look down on their mother, because their Indonesian mother, because they go to school in this environment. But I think there is institutionalized racism at the school. And I think it's hard to escape that. I can see that it's part of the culture that my daughters are growing up in, and that concerns me. Because of Indonesians being very clearly second-rate citizens, for certainly the vast majority of our students, they see Indonesians in subservient positions, primarily drivers, nannies, maids, gardeners, secretaries, what have you. How many Indonesians do you see in power? They don't, right? And she talks about how when she visits her, his Indonesian wife's family's village and goes with her daughter, if he's there, he says his mixed race daughters refuses to play with the other Indonesian kids. And his daughter would just sit with him, because his daughter feels like, you know, I'm also white and I want to be with my white father, and just refuses. But he says that when I don't go with my family and it's just the mom and the kids, then she's quite happy to like play with the other Indonesian kids. And the daughter at the time was about 7, maybe 7, 8, something like that. And he kind of says, you know, I think my daughter's a little bit racist, but you know, grows up, you'll kind of grow out of that. And Nick again talks about the hidden curriculum. It's what we say we teach, which I believe we believe in and we're trying to do, but by the very makeup of the institution, we are teaching this hidden agenda. It's not like somebody's being out to try to teach it, but it's being taught because it's our daily experience here. And there's no other school I want to send my children to. I do really believe in the school. I really believe that it's an incredible education that we're offering, and the multiculturalism and all of those aspects are powerful and good, but there is that dark underbelly that isn't being addressed here. And I think it poisons the system to some degree. So how is the hidden curriculum taught? You know, what is it and how is it taught? There are many ways. I'm just going to mention a few. First, teachers as gatekeepers, and mainly white teachers as gatekeepers. And what I saw was a lot of the teachers would try to define what third culture kids mean. You know, it's like, oh, everyone's, and when I say I'm doing research on third culture kids, the teachers would say, oh, everyone's, you know, all the kids are third culture kids here. Oh, except the Koreans, maybe, and maybe not the Indonesians. And also the teachers would give a stamp of approval of who they thought was the ideal international school student. And when they said ideal, it would be the mainstream English-speaking students, where you had a Black student, white student, you know, well, majority was white, but then you had Black and Asian and so on and so forth. So racially it looked mixed, but culturally, most of them were very Westernized, spoke English with a native accent, and so on and so forth. And the ones who did not get the teachers' approvals were the Indonesian Korean groups, as I said. But when I go to the Indonesian group to check them out, the so-called Indonesian group is actually, you know, majority are Indonesian, but you know, ethnically Chinese Indonesians, and then you got native Indonesians, but also you'd have, you know, a couple of Taiwanese, a couple of Filipinos, Koreans, mixed race kids, and so on and so forth. So it's actually quite mixed, but from the outside, from the teacher's perspective, they look Indonesian because they're all Asian. And they all can speak Indonesian fluently, but they would throw in Indonesian words here and there. And so teachers thought they were all Indonesian. But when you actually ask teachers, like, you know, what about so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, they could recognize that actually, oh yeah, you know, that kid's actually Korean and that's, you know, Filipino. But as a group, they just would forget that and kind of appear as, you know, Indonesian. And another way was, you know, I'd walk into an economics class one day and again, you know, I'm doing research on third culture kids. Teachers, oh yeah, they're all third culture kids and they're all mingling together. Oh, except for the 2 Koreans, I don't know, they're always sitting together. And it wasn't like I was asking about it. They just offer this information. But when I sit with the Korean, you know, when I would sit in class and observe, I would notice that every so often, one of the kids would kind of whisper to the other one, and then the other one would whisper back. And after observing for a while, I realized that one of them didn't speak English very well. The other one was fluent. And so it was always, one was asking about vocabulary and the other was helping. And when I interviewed the one who did speak English well, he would say, you know, I know the teachers want me to mingle, but I can't because I know that the other kid, you know, my fellow Korean is struggling with English. And I've been lucky enough to be able to go through the international school system since young. And if I didn't sit with her and I didn't help her, that would be really selfish. But the teachers can't see this. And so they kind of act as gatekeepers about who's approved and who isn't. And also as role models, I noticed teachers would say, you know, come to me and ask me, you know, how can we get the Korean kids to integrate? How can we get the Indonesian kids to integrate? But in, you know, what they say, let's meet and talk about this. But you know, meet over lunch. And I said, okay, are we meeting in the staff room? And they're like, oh no, you know, the staff room, there's like a lot of Indonesian staff and they're always speaking in Indonesian. So I kind of feel uncomfortable. So let's go to the students' cafeteria. And so in that sense, the teachers want the kids to integrate, but they themselves are not aware, not even aware that they themselves aren't doing it, you know, because if as adults they find this difficult, then, you know, you should be able to empathize, but somehow that's the blind spot. As cultural brokers. And this is where, you know, I've seen AIELOC webinars talk, you know, it's really important to have a diverse staff because I would follow some students around and I would see that in the mainstream classes where its main language is English, you know, like a science class, a biology class or whatever, Japanese students, Korean students, they would just be dead silent. And you could tell that they're tense, they're trying really hard to keep up. But the minute they go into a Korean class or a Japanese class where the teacher is Japanese or teacher is Korean, complete change of personality. There'd be like just bouncing off the wall, joking with the teachers, dancing, and you know, teacher asks a question, they participate. But I think from the mainstream teachers, they can't see this. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, Koreans and Japanese are just, you know, quiet in class. Teachers of authority, Nick, the other teacher, has already talked about that, you know, the physical representation, cultural representation. How much time do I have? I think I've been going on for quite a while. Curriculum, textbooks, actually I'm going to skip this because you probably already know this. But I want to talk about this concept of blackness and whiteness. Where there's a sense you use blackness to get closer to whiteness. I don't know if you're familiar with it, I think you are. So for example, in the US, you would have Asians in general try to distance themselves from, say, African Americans to get closer to whiteness. And then you'd have Asian Americans distance themselves from the new Asian immigrants to get closer to whiteness, sort of like, you know, I'm not like those new immigrants who don't speak English well, and get closer to whiteness and so on. But in the international school setting, the ones the students use is the ESOL students, the English as a second language speaker students. Sort of like, you know, I'm not like those ESOL students. So, and that's how they would try to get closer to whiteness. Or, and then international school, or they would use the Korean kids, you know, it's like, I'm not ethnocentric like the Koreans, and therefore I'm more multicultural and therefore more approved by the school. And the school itself, you'll see that they would try to distance themselves from the local, from Indonesia, the host country. And so the more local connections you have, obviously it's sort of like you're not international enough, which is kind of weird because how can you be international if you're not engaging with the locals, the host society? But I was saying, you know, I wanted to talk about the third culture kid perspective, about how it's nuanced and not quite the same as in the US and so forth. I think I'm just gonna share one story and then you can ask others if you want to, but the TCK teacher story. So there was one particular teacher whose classroom was always filled with students during lunchroom and so on. After school, they'd come to her class and just hang out. And they were saying this is like a phenomena. And when I asked the students, like, why do you like this teacher so much? And they said, oh, you know, she really understands teenagers. Like, you know, she really gets us. But then when I interviewed the teacher, and this is a white teacher, white American teacher, I interviewed the teacher, and it turns out that this white American teacher had grown up in Hong Kong and had gone through the British British system, British schooling. And she says, when I'm around white people, she says, you know, when I'm around Americans, I feel like I don't feel comfortable. I feel most comfortable when I hear Chinese being spoken around me, because was her upbringing. And so, and it's like the students don't cognitively understand that, but they can feel that sense of unspoken cultural understanding, where they feel like the teacher gets her. So it's not always just black and white race, is sort of what I wanted to talk about. And also, you know, I started with my own privilege. I wanted to talk about as well, often this whole racism thing, you know, it's like, it's such a bad thing. It's seen as such a bad thing, but you can have internalized racism where you're feeling inferior or you're feeling superior against, you know, if you're an Asian speaking English, then maybe you feel superior towards Asians who don't speak English. You can feel that, but also actively counter that with your behavior. Just because you think it, you feel it, like, it doesn't mean you're acting that way. So in my case, I felt that, and I had these prejudices, but also at the same time, I would find that when I'm in a group where, you know, somebody seemed like they were feeling uncomfortable because they didn't speak English, I would reach out and try to make them feel comfortable. And so just wanted to, you know, so basically those two feelings can coexist at the same time. And it's something that you're actively always having to counter. Yeah, I could go on.
All right, so at this time, we do have about 12 minutes left. If you want to jump into Q&A, we're definitely fine to do that.
Sure. That'd be cool.
So at this point, if anyone has a question, feel free to type it into the chat, and we'll get to it.
Yeah. I guess while we wait, I could also add that sometimes it feels a bit like we're going up a big hill, and might feel like it's such a big, you know, when are we ever going to get to a place where we can change? But so I wanted to share about, there has been precedence for change. The Japanese TCK experience called Kikoku Shijo, where in the 80s, when Japanese kids who had grown up overseas returned to Japan, they used to get bullied, was seen as not enough, not Japanese enough, etc., and had a hard time. But then the parents lobbied for the kids and said, look, this is an issue. And you know, a lot of the kids, because they didn't have enough Japanese, couldn't get into Japanese universities and so on. But now it's completely changed, and those who come back speaking English are considered, you know, cool, and they get to go to better universities and so on. There's special entrance exams for them, and so they you know, it is possible for change like that to happen.
All right, so looking at the chat, I see some questions are popping up now. So here is one. What strategies did you find that work for schools to become more anti-racist?
I have not seen it yet because at the time I was just silently, quietly trying to, what do you call it? Expose the racism, because this was, I did my research in 2009, finished my dissertation 2014, 15, something like that, and published the book in 2017, 18. And so at the time we didn't have this conversation. So my job was to expose it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And someone asked about your research question. Could you share that with us as well?
Research question. The research question initially was just, you know, what's the Asian experience of the international school? Because for myself, my sister went to a local school, Indonesian school, and I went to an international school. And so I could see, and culturally we're very different. She's very Indonesian, speaks Indonesian as a first language, and like just culturally we're different. It's like we're from a different country. And so I could see the very strong impact of international school education on kids. And, you know, at the time, the third culture kid literature was all about the host country, but I'm like, it's not just about the host country, it's about the school as well. So yeah, what's the Asian experience like for Asian experience of the international school? That was sort of, I didn't kind of set out looking specific. I sort of had an idea about, you know, the internalized racism and stuff, but it wasn't like I was gonna completely expose this racist thing. But as I went, I just kept hearing these things coming up.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one. Might you share your thoughts on the relationship between structural racism and the EAL programs delivering instruction primarily in English? I know this is something we talked about a little bit.
Sorry, what's the EAL program? English.
Yes, additional language.
The link between the two?
Yeah, between structural racism and English as an additional language or a second language.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the whole idea that English is the most powerful language, you know, that gets perpetuated, and that if you don't have the right accent, then, you know, you're not considered good enough. In that sense, is that what you mean? Or is it more the way people teach, saying you can't speak English, or you can't speak any other language than English at school?
That kind of hits at it, but just really your ideas based upon your observations, and you can even bring in, I guess, your experience working with the TCKs of Asia. I'm sure those are conversations that have been had in that community regarding structural racism that students or alumni may have experienced in schools, and this relationship to how that the language of instruction is primarily English.
Sorry, also, that was my question. I guess I was really curious about how we wrap our heads around that in international schools, considering that English is one of the primary draws for families paying our ridiculous international school tuitions.
I guess what I do want parents to know is, you know, the idea that parents want white teachers and, you know, with the right accent, so on and so forth, is that when students feel like they're not represented, they're not, you know, the teachers don't look like them, don't feel like them, that makes them feel like they don't belong, right? So that internalized racism happens. And also that emphasis on English, as I said before, means that they start to lose their home language. They start to feel like their home language is, it's almost embarrassing to speak in their home language at school and whatnot. And that can affect the way they feel about it. And that matters when they grow up, because they can't communicate with their parents properly. Or maybe that linguistically they're okay, but culturally they've changed so much that there's sort of like a gulf. Is that sort of what you mean? I'm sorry, I don't think I'm understanding the question fully. And often the reason is that the parents don't understand this because they've never gone through it themselves. And this is why they need to be educated, as opposed to just kind of accepting that this is what parents want. You know, we need to educate that this isn't good. Also, often when, I think this is more recent research that has come out where, and a lot of you might be familiar with this, where if you teach, if a child starts to learn a second language, English, for example, and you don't keep up the home language education, then academically, you know, it'll take 5 or 7 years before they can absorb other subjects in that second language. And it'll affect their academic academic learning. And I don't think parents are aware of this.
All right, so at this time, would you like to jump into the breakout groups? We have about 5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with it myself, but my sense is that if the kids have relationships with locals, you know, when they return, there would be a better sense of belonging in that place, as opposed to just feeling like we don't belong anywhere. Because a lot of them, you know, relationships are important for sense of belonging. So I think those are some of the things I would look for. Like an exchange program with a local school or something.
Great answer. Great points to consider, especially for parents and also for individuals working at international schools to be able to kind of, you know, advocate for some of these systems to be in place at their international school to better support our students and families. At this time, we are running out of time, so we will be moving to the closing.
Oh, the other thing was home language support, I suppose. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, you're welcome.
We want to thank both Dominique and Danau for today's session, but we also want to let you all know that there are other sessions coming up. There was a recent Thai online article, if you did not have a chance to see it, it's entitled Racism in International Schools, focused on educating the parents. And I know that's a piece that Dr. T talked about today, and a lot of schools have already been engaged in conversation around how do we bring parents into the conversation, making sure they're engaged and at the table when it comes to this. And we have an online conference that is free. It'll be held in November with a lot of different folks who are doing this work around the world who will be serving as facilitators. So we invite everyone to that conference. It'll be online. It'll be a combination of synchronous and asynchronous. There'll be things that you can pick and choose that'll be pre-recorded, as well as some live sessions. We're trying to work best with all the different time zones. And then we put also in the chat before we close our, together with Thai Online, we have what's called a commitment to action, just giving folks a chance to reflect on the work that you'll do individually or as a team or as a school, no matter where you are in your journey. I'll repost that sort of one more time, but it's called Commitment to Action. We just encourage everyone to visit that, post comments, post resources. Again, thank you, Dominique, and thank you, Dr. T. I'll turn to you all for any sort of closing remarks before we let everyone go.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to have talk to teachers, because that's who I did the research for, because I can't implement any changes. It's teachers who can do that. So thank you so much for the invitation. Also, I'd love to get to talk to some more teachers and find out a bit more in depth, why you've come to AIELOC and, what's driving you in that sense. So if anyone's interested in being interviewed and whatnot, it'd be great if you could contact me. And I think I'll just put my, it's Twitter at our Gmail, danau@tanu@gmail.com. So, yeah. And thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Dominique, as well. Thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thank you for everyone for coming out this morning, tonight, wherever you are in the world. And really thank you, Dr. T. Your research has really been so helpful and insightful for me. And I also want to encourage everyone to check out the TCKs of Asia Forum. It has been helpful for me, especially as an educator here in China, who are teaching, Chinese students to get a better sense of their lived experiences. That's a great resource as well. And I know you guys have some pretty amazing events and that you put on. All right. So thank you for that. And we're free to go, but if anyone still wants to, hang around, chit chat and talk, we can do that as well.